I'm David Spiver. I'm a programmer and the project lead on Episode 2. Episode 2 starts off right after the end of Episode 1, which when you left Episode 1, you and Alex were on a train leaving City 17, and the Citadel was going up in a spectacular way. Episode 2 starts off right after that, and the train has crashed as a result of the Citadel destruction, and you and Alex are kind of marooned in the wilderness together. In terms of the length, relative to Episode 1, Episode 2 is probably about 20% longer. If you would say that Episode 1 is 4 to 6 hours, then Episode 2 is like 6 to 8 hours in length. Since the episode takes place in an outdoor environment, we thought it would be cool to give players a sweet new ride to drive around in with Alex. And so Jeremy Bennett, who's a concept artist, came up with this idea of a fusion between a muscle car, like a classic muscle car, and some field-produced parts. So what we ended up with is this kind of open-framed car with very strong muscle car lines to it, and muscle car parts to it that has a lot of sex appeal, we think. And the goal of the car from a design standpoint was we wanted people to look at it and say, cool, I really want to drive that thing. As opposed to some of the funkier, more homebrew looking stuff from Half-Life 2. Story-wise in Episode 2, we are telling more story, more explicit story. We felt like it was time to give players answers to a lot of the questions that they've been asking. And so we feel like people are going to be really excited by some of the stuff they learn. They're going to learn both about past story arcs, and a lot of future story is going to be set up by Episode 2. Being the middle episode of the trilogy, it's really important that we set the stage for Episode 3 and the events that are going to take place there. And so in that sense, it's kind of the bridge episode and really meaty in terms of story. Really, our special effects are looking way better. We've also, we're targeting a much higher high end with Episode 2, and so we're pushing on a lot of fronts in terms of shaders and model budgets and texture budgets and things like that. And it all adds up to a much richer visual presentation in Episode 2. In terms of AI enhancements to Alex, we've improved her contextual knowledge when she's in combat regarding things like cover. What you saw in your playthrough was Alex hiding behind counters and shooting over them, or hiding next to windows and actually blind firing over her shoulder out the windows when she was pinned down. And in general, she knows a lot more about her environment and uses that as she fights. How do we tell a more compelling story? Well, I think part of it is just the writing. We really work hard at making our characters engaging and making them more than just iconic characters. We try to make them very nuanced, and our characters have layers. They have conflicts, both internal conflicts and external conflicts with other characters in the story. In other words, they're not simple characters that you can just look at and say, okay, that's the cigar-chomping drill sergeant guy, or whatever. They're characters with real complexity behind them, and I think that's a big part of what makes our stories more compelling than other video game stories.
So the main focus of Team Fortress 2 is on the classes, and making sure that each of those classes have sort of a significantly interesting role relative to the others. And this is something we did in Team Fortress Classic, but we didn't do a very good job of and we learn a lot from it, I think. So we had some really interesting roles there, like the engineer and the medic, but some of them weren't as successful as we'd liked. You know, the medic was an interesting support role, but wasn't incredibly fun, so there weren't a lot of people trying to play him. He was more the guy that you always wanted someone else to play for you. And so we really focused a lot on making sure that all those different roles are really fun. The way the medic works is really interesting and fun, and there's a lot of skill to it, as opposed to just being something which you just run up next to a guy and you heal him, and that's being a medic. We actually wanted being a medic in combat to have a bunch of skill. So the art direction for Team Fortress 2 came from looking at how people were playing multiplayer games. And if you talk to someone else about some experience they've had in a multiplayer game, it doesn't really matter how serious that multiplayer game is. They've probably had a pretty funny experience in there, whether it's vehicles flying up in the air or something from explosions and landing on their friend next to them or whatever. There's always something funny that's happened. And so we started with that. We said, okay, so let's, Team Fortress already has sort of somewhat over the top and exaggerated characteristics. And then we have other problems like, we have this one guy, this heavy class, who literally takes 3 times as much damage as this other scout class. How do we embody that in some visual that makes sense to players? And we took all these sort of sets of problems, and another big one, of course, being how do we have 9 different classes and make it so that when you see one guy this big on your screen, you can tell which one he is. And we took all those problems, we rolled them up together, and we sat down and we came up with a bunch of different art directions that we thought might solve that. And then we picked the one that worked best, which was this fairly exaggerated, stylistic thing where we can do things like having medic beams full of red pluses flying through the air, and guys can fly around the air and jump, double jump and all this kind of stuff. And we can have a guy who's just so enormous that his gun is enormous that a new player who has no idea what the game is can look at that heavy and know, wow, he must take a lot more damage than this other spindly scout, but that scout's running socks and everything clearly tell me that guy can run really quickly. And so that was pretty much where the art direction came from. So the point of each class is really, and perhaps it's good to step back a little bit and ask, why do we have classes at all? Why isn't everyone the same? And the point is that the game is bottling up an experience and calling it a class, and that experience should be unique relative to the others. So in the case of the sniper, the experience might be something like, keeping a large distance between you and opponents, having some time to set up, get your sniper rifle charged up, zoom and get someone in the head. And that should be in sharp contrast to some other experience, like the Pyro, for example, where it's all about ambushing. You have this flamethrower that's incredibly lethal at short range, but completely unable to hurt anyone beyond that short range. And so as a Pyro, faced with someone across a great distance, you're in a lot of trouble. You really want to try and make your way through a bunch of cover until you can get there, and you want to ambush them at really short range. So the reason we spend a lot of time focusing on weapons and stuff for the classes is because we want to ensure that each of those experiences is dramatically different. And this is especially important for the combat classes. It's easy to see why the engineers sort of almost real-time strategy-like experience is dramatically different than the say the spies, outthink my opponent experience. But when we get down to the core combat classes like the heavy or the soldier or the sniper, then we need to make sure those experiences are also dramatically different. And one of the main ways we do that is dealing with the range at which people deal with each other. Snipers are great at dealing with long ranges, pretty bad at dealing with short ranges. Pyros are almost the complete opposite. So we sort of focus on weapon range a lot as a way of dealing with that. Each of the maps in Team Fortress 2 have some overarching goal that each team is trying to achieve. And the main reason we do this is to give sort of a range of potential methods of winning. So some of the classes are really good at killing, other classes are better at other things. For example, the engineer is a fantastic defender. I mean, he does it by killing people, but he's not a very good offensive guy. And so we find that attack and defense, sort of as a general case, allows each of the classes to play an interesting role within the space. And so most of our game modes are built around things like control points or flags, where one team is trying to get somewhere and hold something while the other team is trying to prevent them. And so that sort of core mechanic is the backbone of all the maps. The actual rules over what happens when a team captures tend to vary almost on every map. So on some maps, for example, one team needs to capture and hold 2 areas, and once they do that, they're then able to start launching an assault on the final. Whereas in another map, it's a linear set of 5 points where each team is trying to capture and push back the other team. And so each map has its own sort of rules about how they work, but they all fit within this concept of attack and defense, which allow each of the classes to play an interesting role.
So the story that surrounds Portal, we all started off as students at DigiPen Institute of Technology. There was 7 of us, 4 programmers, 3 artists, and we worked together on a project called Narbacular Drop for our senior game project. And career day rolled around near the end of the year, and Robin Walker came in. He took a look at the game, thought it was pretty cool, and he invited us to come present it at Valve. There was a bunch of people there, everybody was getting really excited, and then halfway through the presentation, Gabe stopped and was like, wait, you guys want to work for us? And we were like, oh yes. So that's a question that a lot of people ask, is how does Portal fit into the Half-Life universe? And it's sort of, right now, it's in a corner of the Half-Life universe that's not yet been explored through Gordon's eyes or through Adrian Shepard or the other characters in the Half-Life universe. This is yet another new character in the Half-Life universe. And basically, you're in the Aperture Science Enrichment Center. It's a science facility that's doing testing on this revolutionary portal gun, and you're one of the test subjects in the test. You really learn more about where Portal fits into the universe from Half-Life 2, Episode 2. The mechanics of Portal are that you control 2 halves of an interlinked portal. You control a blue half and an orange half. Blue leads to orange leads to blue. They're both exits and doorways. And basically you use these to manipulate your environment so that you can traverse it and move objects around it to solve these complex challenges. So you'll have to get one object from one place to another and you use the portals to do it. Or sometimes you have to get yourself from one place to another and you'll fall into a portal, fly out another one and land where you want to be. So it's kind of this complex way of manipulating your environment around you. Later in the game, as you're exploring the facility, you'll find that there's some panels that have been pulled away from the test chamber, and that there's sort of a resistance to this test that's going on, and that maybe there's been people who've been hiding away behind the scenes of the test chamber. And it sort of explains the story of what the game is, and as you're progressing through the game, you'll find more of these and understand maybe what's going on behind the scenes of the test and what your purpose is within it. People tend to call me the Portal Ninja. I think it's a combination of being a longtime gamer and also having more experience with this concept than most people. Having had 3 years now with 1 year of Narbacular Drop and 2 with Portal, I tend to do a lot of play testing on the game, finding bugs, and just as I'm playing through the game, I've learned a lot of new tricks that people haven't realized. For example, you can place portals directly above each other to do an infinite fall. But as you're doing that, if you place another portal on the floor, then you'll fly up out of that one with all the momentum you've gained downwards. And that can propel you over very tall walls. And so that's kind of a trick you can do to get around, all kinds of obstacles.